Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri 1917 diary series on YouTube. It is the 9th of February 2026, around 5:30 in the afternoon, and we have text today. We have the final text, the concluding text from Saturday, the 18th of November. That's the old style Julian calendar. So we did this, or we're doing this diary entry in two sections. So our recap, in the previous section, we had the introduction of this very suspicious character, Lieutenant Korsakov, who had been in the Pavlovsk regiment and was now kicking around the Caucasus, and somehow had gotten letters, a lot of letters for Dmitri that were dated from October 17th, so before the Bolshevik takeover. So in that sense, they were old, but Dmitri hadn't heard anything from any of them since, I think, September. And so they were very, very welcome. Korsakov brought the letters, but he was this shady character who made all kinds of claims. For instance, that he had been offered 500,000 rubles to assassinate Rasputin himself, and that he was an insider, or had inside information about Rasputin's supporters. So I cut the diary entry into two, kind of arbitrarily, just because it was too long to do in one video. But we are diving right back in with Korsakov today. So the first pronoun, the possessive pronoun his, refers to Korsakov. Okay, here we go. Speaking about his current business in Petrograd, he said that he was involved in a counter-espionage organization, etc. I repeat, I don't like him at all, but he nonetheless brought intact letters. Among them was a letter from Laming. Apparently, he's in a terrible state of nerves, but he doesn't write about any unpleasantness, thank God. He found an apartment for me on Kameny Ostrov, and intends to transfer my things there! Exclamation point. Bodya wrote me a letter with a complete description of how Papa's arrest took place! Exclamation point. The letters were generally calm, and Maria's is positively joyous with regard to her wedding. Oh, how sad and painful that I could not be present at that event. Maria N. Laming writes, incidentally, that she is terribly frightened for Borya, who is at the Mikhailovskaya Artillery School. Of course, if I were now to receive newly written letters from home, they would have a different tone. God protect them all. But I will state candidly that with respect to the events now unfolding in the Caucasus and on the Don, blank. Sorry about that. Thoughts of my loved ones had receded somehow to a secondary status. I had somehow overlooked those thoughts, and only when receiving letters from home, I became inexpressibly sad and depressed, and in those moments, everything was horribly painful, and I was homesick again. Again, my soul weeps for home and loved ones. Oh God, when will I be able to embrace them again and speak without end? Only let God protect them all. But now, enough about that. It's time to finish this book with a brief description of what happened last week. So, I don't think you can judge very much from his expressions of emotion on the basis of how I read them, because I'm not reading them like a person in the grip of emotion. On the page, they read very touchingly. But, yeah, we can talk about that. So Korsakov, who has already claimed to have been a prospective contract killer, he said the offer was made, is now claiming that he's a spy with a counter-espionage organization. So, and Dmitri has already told us that he's a very young man. He's younger than Dmitri, who is only 26. And so it sounds to me like he's a guy who's just really having fun while Rome burns, so to speak, and making all this stuff up to impress Dmitri. Yeah, the same question I raised last time. How did he get the letters? You know, he doesn't seem like the kind of person that anybody would be willing to turn over precious things to, personal letters. But on the other hand, you know, it could be just any port in a storm kind of situation. And they weren't letters that had any sensitive content. At least Dmitri doesn't indicate that they were. So Laming, Georgy Mikhailovich Laming, Dmitri's, there's not an adequate word. Tutor doesn't cover it because he and his wife were basically raising Dmitri and Maria both. He was in charge of Dmitri's education. He also, you know, gave lessons to Maria, but he was the surrogate dad. He was not just, you know, a tutor. And he had an apartment, whatever palace they lived in, he had his own apartment for his wife and his son. And Dmitri loved him and was very, very attached to him. And the interesting thing is that Dmitri had always been, since he was an adolescent and we first have his diary entries, he'd always been very good and always been very intent upon gauging Laming's mood. Because if Laming was in a bad mood, then he wasn't the kind of person you could be around and be in a good mood yourself. And so Dmitri was always very sensitive and trying to buffer Laming from anything that would put him in a bad mood. He doesn't seem to have been a bad-tempered person in general. But yeah, Dmitri was very sensitive about things like that. So it's interesting that he says even though Laming isn't writing about anything unpleasant, he still can tell that he's in, you know, a terrible state of nerves, as Dmitri puts it. Okay, so this is very interesting about the apartment. I didn't realize that things were underfoot already, but apparently since they hadn't been in contact, since Dmitri's birthday, which was on September 6th, and Maurer sent him something. Since that time, they hadn't been in contact. So Maurer must have taken this on himself to, yeah, be proactive and move some of Dmitri's things. You know, maybe foreseeing that the palace might possibly be taken over, Dmitri's palace on the Neva River in Petrograd. And so it surprises me that Dmitri doesn't express more surprise about that. Like, you know, why did you lease an apartment for me and why are you moving my things there? But anyway, that was indeed the case. He found an apartment in what was, I don't know St. Petersburg well, but what was apparently a quiet area and where Dmitri's things would be safer than in the palace. So, yeah, he intends to transfer my things there. Exclamation point. So I guess that's the way Dmitri is expressing surprise here. He's not saying, oh, I wish he didn't do that, wouldn't do that. Anyway, Bodya. So Bodya was the baby talk name for Volodya. Obviously, a small child would have difficulty saying Volodya. So it was one of those instances where a small child adapts his own name and calls himself Bodya instead of Volodya, and it catches on. So now that he's a young man, within the family, he's still called by that name. Although, for instance, in Maria's memoirs, she doesn't call him Bodya in her memoir. She calls him Volodya. And, you know, so it was strictly a within the family sort of thing. So, yeah, he sends his big brother a letter with a description of Papa's arrest. Maria sent a description of her meeting with Kerensky to try and get the arrest lifted. And Bodya sends a letter about the event itself. I wonder if that letter survived. If If any of these letters survived, they would now be in Russia, since the Ilinsky family donated them to the Tsarskaya Selo Museum in Russia. But yeah, I'm not sure. My colleagues in Russia, Natalia and Alexandra, did mention that they had read a letter from Dmitri to Bodya, I think. So they haven't sent that to me yet. I have to ask them about that. Anyway, I'm digressing. The letters were generally calm. He said Maria was over the moon about her marriage, which made Dmitri feel particularly bad that he hadn't been able to attend. You know, he approved of it. He talked about that before in an earlier diary entry when he first found out that she was getting married. Okay, and then there's Maria Nikolaevna Laming, Georgy Mikhailovich's wife, and she, for her part, is expressing some, strong concern and fright. She's terribly frightened, Dmitri says. So Borya is her son, and he was Dmitri's playmate growing up. Dmitri was, I think, 7 years older than Borya. But if any of you listened to the diary entries from 1906, 1907, when Dmitri was a teenager, you know how much Dmitri enjoyed playing with Borya. It embarrassed him, but he loved to play toy soldiers with Borya. And so Borya is now grown up, and he's a student at one of the elite military colleges, you could call them. They were not for high school students, but I'm not sure, I shouldn't say that, but it doesn't seem like they were, because Dmitri went to the Nicholas Cavalry School, and this is the Mikhailovskaya Artillery School. So, you didn't start at least until you were 16, probably between 16 and 18 you would start. But Borya was at least 18. So his mother's very worried about him, as well she should be. He's at the artillery school. The artillery school tended to be more on the liberal side, unlike the cavalry school. The General Staff Academy and the artillery school and the engineering school were all more progressives. But the Bolsheviks don't have a high opinion of the people who considered themselves progressives before the Civil War. Anyway, I'm really digressing today. Sorry about that. I know a little bit about what ended up happening to Boris Laming, because he ended up in Seattle, which is not far at all from Portland, Oregon. He did get out of Russia through the Far East, as many people did, through China. And most of the people who got out through China ended up going to San Francisco and the West Coast and spreading out from there. Boris Laming became a petroleum engineer, so he worked in California and I think mainly in California, and then when he retired, he moved to Seattle. He was married, but he and his wife had no children, which is a pity, because those children could have been so useful to talk to with their father's stories of growing up in a Grand Ducal household. I don't think Dmitri saw him again. I think just because of the geographical distance. But anyway, the last thing I want to talk about is that there's always this issue with Dmitri. He can seem very cold in relationship to his family members. And he says outright, you've already heard him say it once, but in other parts of the diaries, that my family are secondary to Russia. The main concern has to be for Russia and what will happen for Russia, not for a person's loved ones. Well, okay, but I think part of that is that he couldn't handle thinking about his loved ones. And that's another thing he talks about. He would just be paralyzed. He would be in such a deep state of depression all the time. Little things would set him off, like hearing the balalaika orchestra playing some sentimental music. You remember that several diary entries ago, and he just couldn't handle it. And so, you know, it was self-protective in a way that he didn't allow himself to think about it. You know, so here he's admitting that my thoughts of my loved ones had receded somehow to a secondary status. Okay, because he's very, very engaged in what's going on in the Caucasus and excited about it, I think. I had somehow overlooked those thoughts. Well, maybe, old boy, or maybe you were just protecting yourself, understandably. Okay, so what do we have next time? We're doing short diary entries, so we will be doing the short entries from the 16th to the 19th of November. Korsakov will be back. We'll have more of what Dmitri has to say about Korsakov. He'll describe more interaction with this deputation from General Przewalski, the head of the Caucasian army. We'll see this sort of interestingly developing relationship with Madame Yevrenova, and a mention of the crown of the Caucasus as something that possibly could, you know, be related to Dmitri. So, yeah, come back for all of that. And, yeah, I hope to see you then. Bye.